If you go to an antique shop, you can buy tintypes that were shot 100 years ago. And so you get to have this dialogue with the past. And if you're making tintypes, you're working on a dialogue with the future as well. Because your children, your grandchildren, whoever will see them and say, oh, I wonder who the crazy guy is that did that tintype back in 2017, you know?
Welcome to Eidos the podcast, where we explore the ways in which ideas take their shape and form through the arts. This podcast is sponsored by Eidos Artworks, publishers of a quarterly journal about art and culture featuring local and international artists. And Notan Artworks, helping clients find artwork for their home or office that inspires serenity in a busy world. And Spokane Falls Community College Photography and Digital Media Production Programs, preparing students for careers in applied visual arts since 1965. And the Richmond Artist Collective, supporting emerging and mid-career artists locally and nationally, located in the historic Richmond Hotel building in downtown Spokane, Washington. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this first episode of Eidos the Video Podcast. My name is Ira Gardner, and I am host and editor. In this episode, we're going to take a look at an early photographic process, and we're going to meet two artists who are making this historic photochemical process relevant in the era of digital technology. The Museum of Modern Art describes photography this way. Since its invention in 1839, photography has served as a medium for documenting, understanding, and interpreting the world. It has radically contributed to the evolution of visual representation, in part by allowing for the documentation of a moment in time, and because of its inherent reproducibility by enabling the wide circulation and distribution of images, which has exploded with the advent of internet and social media platforms. While Nicephore Niepce can be said to have started the ball rolling with his development of the heliograph in 1827, the process required such a slow exposure that the sun traveled across the sky, creating an image without shadows. It was really the almost simultaneous announcements of the daguerreotype process in France and 3 weeks later the calotype process in England that really launched photography as we know it. The daguerreotype is still, in my mind, the most exquisite photographic image, but it lacks something that Talbot's calotype did not, which was reproducibility. Essentially, Talbot's process created a paper negative that could be exposed directly onto another sensitized sheet of paper to reproduce multiple positives. The daguerreotype had superior qualities of sharpness, but could not be reproduced. It was a monoprint. In the end, the process of reproduction became more impactful on culture. Mass media and popular culture became synonymous. In 1851, another Englishman, Frederick Scott Archer, seemed to combine the best of both worlds with the development of wet plate collodion photography. This process involved adding silver nitrate to a solution of collodion and coating a piece of glass or metal and exposing it before the solution fully dried and became inert. When applied to a piece of metal, you had something that was similar to a daguerreotype in terms of some of its sharpness characteristics and being a one-of-a-kind image. And it was vastly cheaper to produce, which made it extremely popular among portrait artists and the consumers that wanted to buy something affordable. If the collodion solution was coated onto a glass plate, you had the ability to use that glass plate as a negative and expose light through it onto a photosensitive albumin paper. The glass allowed photographers to retain a sharpness similar to a daguerreotype and to make multiple reproductions like the calotype. Wet plate collodion photography is the technology that photographers like Matthew Brady, Alexander Gardner, and Timothy O'Sullivan used to document the American Civil War and the vast Western landscape after the war. Stoic images and bleached out skies define this era of photography. Today, this process is experiencing a resurgence of interest from a generation that is looking for something different than current digital pixel technology. Last week, I had the opportunity to spend some time with Dr. Greg Roth, who is an adjunct professor of philosophy and photography at Spokane Falls Community College. He's an enthusiastic practitioner of historic photographic processes. He and I collaborated for 6 months last year on a portrait project where we made 10 types of everyday people who make a difference in our lives. First up in this episode, we get the opportunity to meet Dr. Roth and listen to his explanations of this unique process.
Learn to see, not just look. Learn to see. The two are very different. Looking is what you do in order to survive. Seeing is what you do in order to do photography well. Well, we're looking for a reasonably good scene today, and the good old wheelbarrow, which we've shot several times, is probably as good a candidate as any. This camera is actually from the end of the 19th century, and so it's a wooden camera. The lens is from the 20th century, which is probably good. I'm going to be shooting a rather large plate today. It's called a whole plate, and it's 6.5 inches by 8.5 inches. There's sort of a kind of aesthetic that speaks of substance, of time, of the kind of wonderful experience that is intended to last for a very long time after the plate's shot. It's not just now, it's then when it was shot and for a very long time. If you go to an antique shop, you can buy tintypes that were shot 100 years ago. And so you get to have this dialogue with the past. And if you're making tintypes, you're working on a dialogue with the future as well. Because your children, your grandchildren, whoever will see them and say, oh, I wonder who the crazy guy is that did that tintype back in 2017, you know? And so you end up creating a kind of dialogue with the past and with the present and the future in terms of the aesthetic, in terms of who views it. Originally, in 1851, this would have been done on a glass plate, and I still do it a lot on glass plates. It's called an ambrotype. This, however, is trophy metal, and it's a modern form of this that was first done on what was called Japan steel. And that Japan steel was basically made for this purpose in the sense that they made it black. And that's because this is actually a positive I'm going to shoot. We clean it off to make it look good and also so that it will accept the collodion. Collodion's nothing more than alcohol, ether, and collodion with some salts in it. And in fact, it's pretty common even today. It's used a lot for things like wart removers and so on and so forth once they put some acid in it. No acid in here. So what we're going to do is pour this plate. This process is called wet plate, and that's because all the work that I do on the plate, including shooting it and developing it, has to be done while the plate is still wet. So I'm going to go ahead and pour the plate. It takes a little bit of time to learn how to pour plates, but since I've been pouring plates now for 5 or 6 years, for me it seems to be almost second nature. I'm trying to get the collodion all the way over the plate without spilling too much of it. And so, good. And once we get to that point, we put the collodion that we put on the plate into another bottle, simply because I'm going to reuse it later, but I'm going to have to do a couple little things to it. I'm going to close everything up here and make sure it's all nice and clean. So now the plate has been covered with collodion, and we have to wait for a few moments for it to dry enough so that the collodion is usable for putting in the silver bath. This is all we can do in light. which is kind of nice.
Yeah.
Okay. And then we put it into a silver bath, which is nothing more than silver nitrate and water. And 3 to 5 minutes is enough time, and I use my high-tech timer. Okay, it's probably pretty well saturated. That is a collodion with the silver nitrate solution at this point. So I can open it up, and I take it out. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Okay. And drain it carefully. Then I take and wipe off the back of the plate. Put it into the plate holder. And I'm going to wipe it off again just to be sure that I don't have too much liquid. Silver nitrate's great. It was used a long time in surgery and in eyes, but it makes an awful, wonderful black stain on skin. So you notice I'm using gloves. Okay, so we got it in there. We can go outside and take the shot. Okay, we're going to take off the focusing back and put on the other back. Camera's already set up, already focused, ready to go. And we put the back on. Okay. Now there's no meter in this camera, incidentally. From experience, I have an idea of how long the exposure is likely to be. In this case, I'm going to assume the exposure is about 10 seconds. So make sure everything up here is right. I'm going to check just to make sure. Yeah, good. All right. This is more sensitive to UV light than it is to anything else, though that's not the only part of the sensitivity range. The thing with this today is we have very little UV. I checked it on the weather, and so I knew there needed to be a longer exposure. Also, it's not going to look exactly the same as you would if you had panchromatic film. It's orthochromatic film, in fact. And so some parts of the spectral system record differently. One of the things I know for sure is that looking at the wheelbarrow and it's got red inside, I know red's going to record a lot darker than it would if we were using panchromatic film. Blue skies are very, very light. So because this is really blue sensitive film. And greens, don't know. It always is sort of a guess as to what the greens are going to really look like. 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005, 1006, 1007, 1008. The aesthetic qualities of tintype image are the qualities that you see in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. So I'm going to go ahead and develop the plate and see what we got. Okay. It's coming in real fast, which means in this case, I must have made a really good guess as to what the exposure time should be. That's warmer than I thought it was. Yeah. Okay, I'm wondering why it's doing that. All right. Yeah, it's coming off. It'll do fine. So it's interesting reading about the history of photography. It's like a gentleman I've been reading about recently who photographed for the Pennsylvania Railroad, a man named Rao. And he went from basically wet plate photography all the way to dry plate photography, all the way to nitrocellulose as a substrate. But he kept moving and changing. And so, you know, you don't have to do photography in simply one way. You need to experiment. You need to play with it. The digital world is a world where you do it one way, essentially. This photography is a kind of photography where you can and should experiment. If nothing else, it'll drive you to doing that because it doesn't always come out exactly the same. So for me, doing photography is about getting the image. No matter how I get to it, I will use whatever process. I will go all the way from, say, an ambrotype, which is nothing more than a glass plate tintype, to scanning, to printing on a digital printer. Doesn't matter. It's all photography. This is a wonderful world we're in. I think the problem today is that we have become so compartmentalized in the way we understand things that we've forgotten that the great geniuses of the past did multiple different things. And so we do it one way. I don't think it's technology's fault. I think it's the fault of the way we think about how we do these things. Rao did a number of different things in terms of photography, all the way from wet plate to nitrocellulose substrate. That was true too of Jackson, true of the really great photographers. They went with the flow. Stoddard, Seneca Ray Stoddard in the Adirondacks, went all the way from wet plate all the way through nitrocellulose. And in all those cases, they built on the past. They had the experience. They knew what it could do and the possibilities that were there. And knowing those possibilities was what made them the great photographers they were. Okay, been doing wet plate photography for about 6 years. First time I did it was actually in England at Talbot's home at Lake Hawk Abbey with the George Eastman Museum's program there. The reason I really like to do wet plate photography is it's so hands-on. I get to create everything from the chemicals I use in terms of mixing them to the plates I use, especially if I'm using glass plates. I get to coat the plates. There's something elemental and something very fulfilling about doing wet plate photography, despite the fact that it's difficult sometimes. You don't always succeed. Wet plate is relevant to today's digital world because professional photographers and those that are really into doing good photography need to have something besides simply digital capture. I like to do digital capture too. I enjoy it very much. But there's a difference in quality, a difference in the look, a difference in the production of a wet plate, whether it happens to be tintype or it happens to be on glass. It's still different. It looks different. You can scan it and it will still look different. And I think that professional photographers especially need it because they can offer a quality, right? A custom piece. Wet plates, especially tintypes, are one-offs. There's no other one. You can scan them, that's okay, but it's a one-off. It's a real artistic construction that you make when you do wet plate. It's just marvelous. I love it.
Well, Greg has certainly been an inspiration to me. His gentle coaching and teaching me the wet plate process has inspired me to do some original work. And I think when we think about originality and think about working with the tintype in particular, as my next guest is about to share with us, that there's something about knowing that there's only that one image, that everything else is a copy, is pretty significant. That psychologists have looked at why we value original artwork so much more than reproduction. And it comes down to this, that when you look at that one original piece, you're looking at a creative act, that was the moment that something happened. And I think that's a pretty I think that's pretty important, and I think somebody who is incredibly creative, is making work all the time that are one of a kind, is my next guest, Cindy Groepper, who I think is a very talented artist. So I'm here with my friend Cindy Groepper, who is a wet plate photographer, among other things, and we just wanted to talk a little bit about, what do you love about wet plate photography?
Well, I love it because it's tactile. It's everything you do from start to finish, you do by hand, and it's creative. If I flub up, I can wash the plate off again and start over again. So it's one of those, it's almost like a Polaroid in a sense, but I don't know, it leaves some earthy, textury kind of feel, and I love the old time feeling that it gives you in a picture.
How'd you get started with wet plate?
Oh, my son came over for Christmas one time and he said, "Hey, Mom, let's do something fun." And so he suggested we do wet plate. And we've never done it, so we bought the kit to do it, and it was a real basic kit. And then after he left and went home, it was like, I kind of like that. That was kind of a fun process. So I went down to Denver and learned to process down there. It was a wet plate process, and then came back and I was thinking, who in Spokane does this? And I found Dr. Roth from Spokane Falls, and he worked on that. So he kind of pushed me along and helped me to find some more people to take lessons from, or clinics from. So I went back to New York and took John Coffer's workshop there, and then last fall spent a couple weeks in Italy with Luther Gerlach doing that. And so I've learned a lot just from those people. And then from there, it's just experiment forward.
And you and I had a chance to meet through the process of you working with Greg, because we were working on that portrait project. And in fact, one of my favorite portraits from that whole project was the one I did of you. That was a lot of fun. How would you describe the differences between the wet plate photographers that you studied with? How is Osterman different from Luther? What have you picked up from each person that's a little bit different?
Well, some people are more technical. Some people are artistic, and in wet plate you can't get perfection. It's just, you get what you get, and there's a lot of particulate on the plate, satellites they call them, or things like that. You can't control the process very well or completely, and so it's sort of like whatever the chemicals do for you for your picture, it's what you get. And a lot of times I don't get what I think I should be getting, and so I'll just take it and wash it off and reuse it again. It's a kind of a nice recycling kind of project. You can use it a couple times, but I use it a lot for recycling to find out what the exposure time will be, and then I go to a good plate and do it from there.
Nice. Let's take a look at some of your work. It's been very interesting to get to know you, because you haven't really ever described yourself as an artist, and yet your work just screams of artwork. I think it's beautiful. I think you have a distinctive aesthetic to your work. What are some of the themes that you work with in your compositions? What do you use wet plate photography to photograph?
Well, I took a class from you because I wanted to learn portraits, and doing portraits with wet plate, that's not easy because the exposure time sometimes has to be a real long time, and so for the subject to sit there for any length of time, it's difficult. But I've wanted to use it for portraiture. I also like to just go outside and take pictures of landscapes, but I like a lot of still lifes. To me, I like to set up a still life, and I love the vintage look of like the early 1900s, 1920s. The boat hats, the derby hats, the old, clothes they wore back then, the shoes, the things, just to get a vintage-ish kind of feel to it.
In fact, I see a lot of what they used to call Orientalism in art. There's definitely a Asian element to some of your nature and landscape imagery, particularly your still life. You brought one today that really stood out to me, that I thought was just incredible. Yeah, let's pull that out and take a look.
I have books on all the old Japanese art. I love Japanese art. I love kimonos. I love anything simplistic in the Japanese fashion. I don't know. I'm drawn to it. I just don't know why. I haven't discovered how it all works together right yet.
Some people try to articulate it. I think you just do it, and I think to me, maybe that's more valid. Maybe that there's in terms of a Zen approach, talking about it kind of defeats the purpose, so to speak. You just seem to naturally do this. Beautiful image. And then speaking of portraits, you brought one of those along today as well.
This one?
We'll start with that one.
Oh, my grandson.
So how long an exposure was this of your husband, who looks like a little bit of the man from Snowy River? That's... I
think that was probably probably 15. We had some sun it was an outdoor exposure. It was sun from behind and shooting into the shadows. So that was a 15 second exposure.
What's really interesting to me about this portrait is it illustrates so clearly the difference between painting and photography, in that while we think of 15 seconds as a long time to sit still, a portrait being painted, the sitter has to sit still for so long.
That's true, yeah.
And what's really interesting is that there's about 20 facial muscles that are constantly twitching, that if you look at painting that was done early on, they always have a softer quality to them because it ends up averaging out, because you don't see it with the naked eye, so to speak, doesn't notice the detail. But the photograph, even though it's expanded, it's not that one fraction of a second, 15 seconds, you still record this really, there's a crispness to it that's very timeless. That's a beautiful image. And then, of course, this one is absolutely poetry.
I like that. I wish again, the imperfection of wet plate is I have these little striations of silver through his hair, and I don't know why that happened, except that I think that the plate was dirty, and so all these plates that you ordered to do your plates on, they need to be cleaned. And I think once I cleaned it with denatured alcohol and then some distilled water, then the plate took the pictures better. And this was before I realized I needed to clean the plate prior to pouring the collodion.
The poet in me says it looks like it's raining.
Oh, yeah. I love that picture.
It's a gorgeous image. And tell me about, who is this in the...
That's my grandson, and I had him on a stool, and I said, look at the book, pretend you're reading the book and stuff. And he's a very smart little boy, but he has a hard time sitting still. Oh my gosh, every little twitch, as you said, 20 muscles in your face. Yeah. He's twitching all over the place, and somehow, for some lucky reason, we got an exposure like that. I think it was easier for him to concentrate on something than to look at me and think, I don't want to twitch. So.
Well, I think, there's just something so, like you said, tactile, that you've created this memory, this document that there's something that transforms. There's a spirit, I think, that exists in both those portraits. And of course, this still life as well. What else did you bring?
Well,
it's like Christmas today.
Yeah, I have. You can choose from these what you want to.
Well, out. This is fun.
The euphonium.
Now, was this done
at your studio?
This was done at the Richmond Artists Collective studio, and so we had quite a windy day, and you had a background of a palette that kept falling forward, but
and the hat wouldn't stay straight.
The hat got crushed, and it turned out to make this image. I mean, it's just a wonderful, wonderful image. So fun to be a part of that process with you. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Let's take a look at some of the images that we have on the screen, because this is kind of gives people a sense of your aesthetic style. And I look at the formal composition here; it's just beautiful.
Thank you.
And you seem to really some of your work with the way you blend old technology and science with it is, I think, gives us a pause to think about and reflect about the world we're in today by looking at the past. I mean, I don't know if that's something you consciously think about, but there's a theme here, for example, of the 3D viewer and how important looking and seeing is to our understanding of the world.
Yeah.
Tell me about that one.
Well, I can't remember if it was Strand or Steichen. One of them did a study on sunflowers. And so last summer I tried to grow my sunflowers, and my sunflowers didn't grow very well, but you can buy them at the store and stuff. And I just loved how he had positioned the flower. It was just one gigantic head of a flower and a real close-up of it. And so it was like, they said he did a whole study of sunflowers, and I thought, well, I can grow sunflowers, and I can do a study of it. So that was going to be, this is going to be my study. So this year when I have some sunflowers, I'm hoping to get a great big head and have it just falling over a little bit, and then take pictures of it, because I think they're just a beautiful flower.
Do you happen to remember what kind of exposure time you had for that exposure?
That was a while ago. That was last year. I don't know. Probably, I usually, earlier on in my taking pictures, I left it wide open, so it was like a 5, 6, or 8. I rarely go to 16, but just recently started doing that, and that's kind of brought in a new element of intrigue.
But is it like a 15-second exposure?
Oh, the exposure
20?
time.
Yeah.
That was out in the sun. It was probably about a 15 to 20 second exposure.
Although, in this theme of wet plate being about slowing down, when you think about how many months did it take for you to grow your subject of your photograph?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this is all about an investment of time and really having to think about it and plan ahead, aren't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's one of my favorites. I love that. I love the scientific. I love flowers in it. It's something you wouldn't expect. You'd expect chemicals or something scientific, and I thought flowers brought a great peacefulness to it.
It does make one think about how early science was so much about direct observation and gathering samples, and the role that photography played in becoming the de facto document that we would use to record those findings. But actually this brings back the time of when they would sketch, and even when we look at the photographs of Carl Blossfeldt's doing those botanical studies, that somehow that's where photography found itself initially, was as a science that through the practice became the art. And I think that's part of what this is, a juxtaposition of science and art, just as the wet plate photography was. These are just gorgeous. I think
it's an old oil can back there. It's orange, and I wasn't sure how dark it would come out. It came out pretty dark.
So how often is what you end up with different than what your eye sees?
Practically every time.
Yeah, that's that. Lady Eastlake in the 1850s wrote this article about, gee, it just seems that some things are more photogenic than others, that photographers had to go out certain rocks and trees and certain textures would show and other things wouldn't. And we were just scratching the surface of understanding the spectral sensitivity of the film materials we're working with. And so with wet plate, you're working with orthochromatic film, right? So it doesn't see the blue, does it?
It doesn't see color.
Yeah.
I have this hand, and I just love using it. It's just, I don't know what it is, but I kind of like the, I don't know, grotesqueness maybe of it, or I don't know. It's a very good hand. It shows the wrinkles, the tendons, and the veins in it. Not in that picture as well, but in other pictures I've taken with it.
Now you're retired now. What was your career?
I was a nurse.
So I think it's interesting how biography informs. It's you probably spent a lot of time holding hands and taking pulses and giving shots. Very interesting. And that is just a wonderful vanitas still life, isn't it? I mean, it's the skeleton and the hand both are not so subtle reminders of our limited time.
Mortality,
yes. Yeah. Again, just beautiful, beautiful compositions. Well, I think this is a great slide to end on. It just really brings us back to photography, and thank you so much for sharing.
Welcome.
It's been wonderful.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah. So I'd like to end this episode with something that we can take away from this wet plate photography and bring into the digital world, and that is how we use our cell phone when we make a photograph with it. There's an assignment that I actually give my students where I tell them I want them to make a cell phone daguerreotype or a cell phone wet plate portrait. And what I mean by that is this idea that you slow down, that you engage the subject in looking, and I give this rule where you have to hold the camera still and you have to lower it and present it very straight on, symmetrical to the person you're photographing, and you have to wait at least 30 seconds or a minute before you click the button or you push on the screen to make the image. And it's amazing. It really works in that the qualities of this digital photograph take on something of a greater significance, that the person you're photographing is transformed into something empowering. And so with that, I want to leave us with a appreciation for the work of this man, Eugene Atget, especially as we look at what's happening in Paris, and my heart goes out to those people living in that city. It's one of my favorite places I've ever visited in the world. But Atget is renowned for the photographs that he made so lovingly of Paris and the French countryside. He exposed over 10,000 glass plate negatives in his career. So when we think about the amount of work we've just witnessed Dr. Roth go through, and we see the kind of work that Cindy Groepper is doing, to imagine making over 10,000 of those plates, I think the message that we're getting is to slow down, take a look, and really appreciate. And I think these messengers from the past, Atget, and the messengers of today with Dr. Roth and Cindy, are giving us the opportunity to see our world anew through the eyes of history. And in that, maybe we can enjoy one another a little bit further. I know it's certainly made a difference in my photography, and I hope it will make a difference in the art that you are making. Thank you for being with us on this very special first episode of the Eidos podcast. You can find out more at www.eidosartworks.com.